Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly 90-minute deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
My name is Lisa. I'm a clinical psychologist and a college counselor. I am a parent of a boy in elementary school, a girl in middle school, and a girl in college. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, most college students don't graduate in 4 years, so colleges and the government count 6 years as a success. A very interesting article by Jon Marcus of the Hechinger Report. Our question from a listener is Lisa and Mark discussing how to effectively randomly talk to students when you visit a college campus. Our interview is with Kevin Newton, the founder of An Education Abroad, on how to do college overseas, part 1 of 2. And our college spotlight comes to you from Iowa. It is the flagship university of the state, the University of Iowa.
Dave, I'm learning a lot from our responses from our questionnaires, and one of the things I'm learning is you and I do not have a career as political commentaries. We are not any threat to Nate Silver. As our listeners have said, chill on the politics. So point well taken.
No problem.
Stay in a lane. I tell students to stay in their lane, so I have to follow my own advice. Stay in our lane, so it's all good. For our admissions tip, so I was talking to a student I'm working with actually overseas, and their top choice is George Washington. And I just said to them, great school. Just are you following what's going on with the financial challenges and the current president? And they said, no, what are you talking about? And so my tip is this. For all of the schools that you are considering, put their name in Google, and Google has an option to click the news. And you click the news, and it will take you back to any time the school has been in the news. You can keep going back and read page after page and go back years if you want. But it's a really good way to find out the cutting edge issues on campus. So I actually did it with her, and she was able to see the financial challenges as well as the president challenges. Still very interested, but she's going in with her eyes wide open. So read the past news article by using Google's news feature for any school you're interested in. Try it. It's a fascinating endeavor. All right, Dave, for the challenge. This is a term that's, picking up a little bit of, I'd say, more popularity in recent years. And the term is on-site admissions. What is on-site admissions?
That's my term, on-site admissions.
May not be yours if you don't get it right, but go ahead.
Okay, I'm guessing here. Maybe it's like when you have to go, I don't know, when you have to go to the college and they admit you right up. I have no idea. On-site admissions.
I give you credit for that, even that I know you didn't know what you're talking about, because it is schools that literally sit down with the student either at the college or on a high school visit, and they do a transcript review and they offer an acceptance right there, right on the spot. And it's one way. It's obviously schools that are not doing holistic admissions. They're not reading essays and recs and things, right? But there's schools that are doing admits just off transcripts. And to be honest, it's a pretty effective way for them to stir up excitement and enthusiasm for a student and to possibly get enrollment. And for schools that, obviously these tend to be less selective institutions, but it's something that I've definitely noticed is on the rise with less selective institutions, and it's called on-site admissions. So you guessed your way into that one, but I'll give you credit.
Hey, that was behind the back 360 from the three-point line. Swish, horse.
Basketball wannabe you. All right, the big number, and the big number is a big number indeed today, even though it may not look that high, but it is $81,000. And you think, well, what is $81,000?
I know what that is.
What is it, Dave?
Cost of tuition and all in for the average private college?
No, the cost of tuition all in for the University of Virginia's McIntyre School of Commerce,
Oh,
public flagship school, north of 81K for an out-of-state student.
well, I
That's
knew
yeah,
that because I just sent in my monthly payment.
yeah. Yeah, but public institutions
I
are,
know, that's amazing.
supposed to somewhat serve the public. Now, in fairness to UVA, they are one of the few schools that claim to meet full demonstrated need. So they do have generous financial aid, but still, come on. North of 81,000 for public school? It's a little ridiculous. Actually, I have to say this. There's one point I didn't make about GPA. So one of my last things I never said when I ran it on GPA last week is that some schools do not recalculate. So what that means is if a school has massive grade inflation or gives so many points in their weighted GPA, some schools actually can get away with that because some schools just take whatever numbers on the transcript and push that in, which absolutely encourages a high school to inflate their GPAs. I just had to get that last little bit of GPA rant out of me. Okay, take it away, Dave.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
All right, we are talking about most college students don't graduate in 4 years, so colleges and the government count 6 years as a success. There's a great article by Jon Marcus of the Hechinger Report. I'm going to make this brief because there's a lot to talk about. Bottom line is the Biden administration recently proposed $62 billion to improve college completion rates. Why is that? Because according to this article, 90% of students begin college expecting to graduate in 4 years. Only 45% of them do so. And for the last 3 decades, we've been measuring college graduation success over 6 years, not 4. Well, why is it? It goes back to 1989 when Bill Bradley, a senator from New Jersey, and Edward Kennedy tried to make colleges accountable for their graduation rates, but they passed a law saying that they only have to do 100 and hit 50% of the standard completion time. And so the universities originally pushed for a formula that only counted full-time students. And it wasn't until 2017 when they were forced to count all the students that graduated. And what they found was that the 4-year completion rate was under 50%. So why is this an issue? Well, they talked about multiple reasons why students don't graduate, including arriving unprepared, taking too few credits, working while in school, changing majors, running out of money, family obligations, and also by the fact that the colleges don't help because they pile on additional requirements, they fail to provide enough courses, and they don't mind because they get extra credits and extra money. But Mark, I'm going to stop here, and we're going to dive right into why is this a big issue about kids taking over 6 years to graduate. How would you like to start this off?
Well, I'm going to have a very contrarian view, and it probably will surprise you, maybe you a little bit. I mean, you know me really well, and certainly a lot of our listeners. And so I certainly will acknowledge there's some things colleges can do they're not doing, but I'm really tired of colleges getting all the blame on this discussion. And let me make my case. So first of all, let's just take a look. I looked up the 4-year graduation rate, Dave, for Yale and Karis. So, Davidson and Yale. So Yale's is 88.3, Davidson's is 87.5, 4-year. So why are those graduation rates so high? Well, they're high for a few reasons. One, students that come in with a 4.0 average graduate at almost double the rates of students with a 3.0 average. And families that go to these are private institutions that cost, you just finished saying what Yale costs, and Davidson's close behind. That cost is kind of, cheese, dough, whatever, use your term, moolah. Families have resources that send their kids to these schools, and schools have resources. And so that's why the graduation rates are so high. But that's not the average institution. Now do you take a single mom who's a dental assistant, working full-time, part-time, timing as an Uber or Lyft driver, they're not going to be on a 4-year traditional residential model plan. That just is not the norm for certain kids, depending on the social class that you come from and the schools that you attend. And so here's a quote I want to read from the article, and I think there's a lot of truth to this quote. Here's what it says. Who are we measuring this for, and to what end? Asked Peter Smith, a former congressman, the author of Stories in Educational Underground, The New Frontier for Learning and Work, and professor of innovative practices in higher ed at the University of Maryland Global Campus. What we should admit is a 4-year completion rate where it works is working for a very limited number of students, Smith said. The mainstream model is shifting to a truly lifelong in and out, come and go education model. And for some people, that's 4 years or 2 years. But for most people, he said it's not. And that means it's time to find new ways of measuring success. The counting system we have, 6 years, 8 years, is really telling us about how the traditional system is unable to meet changing aspirations. I do think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, another point. Since the 1970s, we have been walking back our commitment to funding at the federal, state, both the federal and state level, and it's ridiculous that we fund local high schools by property taxes. And so you're robbing institutions of gazillions of dollars and then faulting them for not delivering the results. It'd be the equivalent of you've got a 2-parent family, they both work, they each make $60,000. And their employer comes into both the mom and the dad and says, fortunately, things are tough here. We're going to have to cut your pay back from 60 to 20. So instead of living off 120,000, now you got to live off of 40,000. And then you have some noxious neighbor or relative, some irritant, who notices that your kids need some dental work and they speak up, what's going on here? You might want to take your kid to the dentist, or I notice your kids aren't eating that healthy, and they speak up, and you're like, I can't afford a doctor. I can't afford a dentist. I can't afford the food I'd like to buy. That's the equivalent of a lot of what we're doing. And if you take a look at what professors are paid at most schools, it's tantamount to minimum wage at most schools. And more schools have to lay off true professors and pay adjuncts who just literally make peanuts. And it's really the adjuncts making minimum wage. I'm not trying to say tenured professors make minimum wage, but tenured professors at most institutions and full professors, they don't make that much. They do at the elite institutions. Why? Because the schools have had their purse strings just cut because we don't invest in education. And also, where's the criticism about K-12 schools not preparing kids adequately to come in and do work? And so a college tries to prepare someone for a pre-med curriculum, and a lot of people drop out, and then the colleges take all the blame. And another point, you can say, well, what about better advising? Can't the colleges do better advising? Yeah, certainly they can. There can be more of an effort to show people if you have to take 15 credits to graduate on time, and you keep switching majors, it's going to prolong your time, or if you transfer, it's going to prolong your time. But what college in the country would not love to have more advisors? It's a financial issue because their purse strings have been cut. So I'm not trying to say there's no place and no responsibility at all for the colleges, but I honestly do not think most of this falls on the colleges. I think it falls on the fact that two things. One, the purse strings are cut. And when the purse strings are cut, you can't expect people to do more with limited resources. And secondly, if colleges wanted to have really high graduation rates, they just need to admit students only that come from 2-parent families where both parents graduate from college, because those kids graduate. But in an attempt to reach more non-traditional students, which you could argue is commendable, you're admitting riskier students that have more family difficulties and financial difficulties. So that's my overall thought, Dave. What do you think?
I'm sorry, Mark, I don't buy it. I do not let colleges off the hook. I think that any institution where 50% of your kids are failing to graduate is completely unacceptable. And I see this as a complete corruption.
Well, Dave, it's not 50% failing to graduate. It's a 45% 4-year graduation rate. As you go up higher, it gets higher and higher. It's failing to graduate in 4 years. Now, failing to graduate in 4 years implies you have to take 15 credit hours, which is a full-time student, which implies that you have enough money. It implies that you have enough money to just completely dedicate yourself to that. And that's a certain social sector that can do that.
Don't buy it. First of all, let me ask you the question. Fine, let's let them completely off the hook. What percentage of kids that start college eventually end up getting a college degree? I'm asking you that. Isn't it less than 65%? 1/3 to about 40% of kids almost who start college never end up getting a degree. And I ask you the question, what other institution survives in this capitalist system with a 40% failure rate? And the fact is, if you can't graduate 40% of your kids, then you let them know straight up, so that 40% don't even waste the money, because nothing is more wasted than college tuition that doesn't end up in a degree. And that's why the perceptions of college are so jaded. Let's not let colleges off the hook. Bottom line is, they do offer inadequate advising. They fail at many times to provide the required courses. They don't take into consideration transfer requirements, but more important, they're not transparent up front. That, hey, whatever your issue, whether you might be underserved, family obligations, or whatever, letting them know, hey, look, there's less than a 30% chance that you're going to graduate. And I think that what colleges have done is that there's been a growth of this industry, of them getting as many graduates as they can to fill their coffers as much as they can. And at the end of the day, well, hey, if 1/3 of our kids don't graduate, well, they were just poor, or they were this, or they had too many obligations. I believe we have to put more responsibility of the universities themselves. Either you graduate these kids or you never accept them in the first place. Because when these kids leave your institution not having a degree and tens of thousands of dollars into debt, it just adds to the cynicism of the general public towards the value of a college degree in the first place.
Well, I agree with that last point. I agree it adds to the cynicism, but you can't just completely cut the purse strings off and expect schools to reach out and not only admit A students who come from, poor families a lot of times, where they have to, because of the financial resources, they have to work so many hours just to pay the bills. And they have to pay, and the bills are high because of the cuts that you've made. I mean, you know why the University of Virginia is over $80,000? Because at one point, the state was providing over 70% of the cost of a public education. And because of state cuts, now they provide 9%. So you take any family's budget and you slash it from 70% to 9% and expect it not to have a deleterious impact. And so why do the high schools are preparing people. The high schools are preparing people up to age 18. Families are preparing people in the home. Why are families not getting any of the responsibility? Government cuts not getting responsibility. The high school preparation, why are they always exempt from all the responsibility and it always falls on the colleges?
No, but the fact is the colleges are the ones that are taking the money. The colleges are knowingly accepting tuitions from thousands and thousands of students every year that they know very well have no chance of graduating. That's what they're doing. It's a cynical ploy to get these kids money so that they can meet their temporary obligations, even though they know that there's no way that this individual kid you just accepted is going to complete your program, right? And that's what I fault colleges for. I think it's corrupt and it's unfair. Okay, it's one thing if you say you have a reasonable chance of completing this, 60%, 75%, 80%. But when you're taking kids that you know darn well from the get-go, there's an 89% chance that this kid will never get a degree, but you accept them anyways, and you take their money, and you make sure they get those student loans, and you cause them to be in debt, and 4 or 5 years later, they leave with no degree, 30, 40, 50,000, maybe $100,000 in debt, with no prospects of redemption. That's not right.
No, I agree with that. But you used the extreme example. You said 80, 90%. I mean, that's not where most schools are. Most schools are, 40% graduation rate in 4 years, 60% in 6 years. It's not like when someone admits they know that person's not going to graduate. Life happens to people. Things happen. their parent dies, or they have a kid and they have to support the kid, and now they're working, and so you don't know that. You don't know those type of things are going to happen when you admit them, but life happens to people. So I mean, yeah, when I will agree with you when you take those extremes, like those schools that are graduating 10 and 20%, but your average schools that graduate 4% in 4 years. And once again, a lot of those times, one of the problems is conflating part-time and full-time people together. Like the norm is not go off to college, live for 4 years in a residence hall, be able to go to school full-time and hardly work at all. That's what you did. That's what I did. That's what our kids did. That's not what most kids did. That's not the norm.
So here's where I will say, give credence to the rankings. The rankings that adequately highlight a school's graduation rate, I think, do deserve some credit. Because anytime you have schools with graduation rates falling below 20, 30, 40%, and there's a lot of them, you have to ask yourself the hard questions why. And I will not accept from those schools, well, we're just taking these kids that are more challenged. If you take the kids that are more challenged, then it is incumbent on you as an institution to figure out how to get them through your system. You can't just throw up your hands and say, hey, well, we weren't getting the bright kids. We just took their money and tried, and they didn't make it, so it's not our fault. No, it is your fault.
Nobody's doing that, Dave. It's like you heard Malcolm Gladwell's podcast on Dillard, and you accepted the point he made that these schools it's incredible for them to graduate 50%, given some of the family challenges where kids literally don't even know where they're going to go home on the break. You accepted that as a great podcast, but now you're like rejecting all of the inferences from that. Like social class. Dave, the easiest way to improve your graduation rate is just to admit kids that come from families where both parents graduated from college. That will jack your graduation rate up immediately because of the model that's been set in the home and because of the funding and the resources that the family have. And I'm actually glad, listen, I'm not an advocate of the extremes. I do agree with your point at the extremes, but I'm glad that some schools take some chances on some kids and attempt. And most people I know in college admissions and colleges, they're doing their absolute best. They're working incredibly hard at very low incomes and very low wages to do everything they can to get kids to the finish line. You almost make them sound like it's a Ponzi scheme. We're going to have to agree to disagree, because I think you're working off of a very middle-class model where a kid can just go to school for 4 years and concentrate on school. And most of the time when you look at schools with low graduation rates, they're people that have to work 20 to 30 hours to make it through. And they're not full-time students. They're part-time students, and they're conflating full-time and part-time student data. And it's just a completely different situation between a kid that's come from a good, solid K through 12 school system. Parents have a lot of resources. They can go live on campus. I point to the CSUs. The CSUs, they do so many things so well in California. But take a look at their graduation rates. Almost every one of them. The only ones that have decent graduation rates are the ones that have wealthier families that are living on campus, that are doing more of the 4-year residential things, like the Cal Polys and the San Diego States. Those are in the 40s to 60s. Look at the graduation rates for the most of the CSUs, and they do a fantastic job. Because they're dealing with a lot of families that working 20, 30, 40 hours, going to school part-time, and all that gets pushed into the data. And nothing's wrong with having a job, going part-time. So much of this is funding, either federal funding, state funding, or the funding of the individual family. You fix the funding issue and you'll see graduation rates soar. So that's my final point.
Okay, my friend. Spirited conversation.
Yeah, we're not always going to agree on everything. That's what makes life interesting. And hopefully we provided two sides for people to process. And hey, a lot of times the truth's in the middle.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, we're counting down. We're going to go from number 20 to number 11 of the wealthiest schools according to endowment per student. At number 20, the Mayo Clinic of College of Medicine and Sciences. So, they've got some outside the box things here. It's not always undergrad. And number 19, Curtis Institute of Music, which is great if you can get in. It has like a 3 to 4% acceptance rate.
Right.
But how did they use their money? You don't pay tuition. So you can get in. It's tuition free, which is great. 18, that's in Philly, by the way. University of Notre Dame, South Bend. 17, Bowdoin College, Brunswick, Maine. 16, Principia College in Elsa, Illinois. And I did not know much about this school at all. Are you familiar with them, Principia College?
I kind of know where Alsip, Illinois is, but that's about the end of it. Is it Principia?
See, Principia. See how little I know?
I don't know. I'm just guessing.
I think it is Principia, but this is how little I know. I've never sent anybody there. I've never even put them on a college list. They're like a Church of Christ school historically. And now we go over the $1 million per student market, number 15, Juilliard in New York. Juilliard. So, yep, Juilliard's got a little bit of money. 14, Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. 13, Franklin Olin College of Engineering in Wellesley, Mass. They have under 400 students, so it's a lot of money for a small number of kids. Number 12, Williams College, Williamstown, Mass. And number 11, their big-time rival that made a big-time announcement this week, Amherst College. They are going no tuition for incomes of like $151,000 or less.
Wow.
Huge announcement they rolled out this week. And now we're up to Williams was over 1.2 million per student and Amherst over 1.2 million per student. So we're up to the big boys.
All right.
Next week, the last 10. All right. So today, Lisa, we're talking about randomly talking to students. You got a chance to do that with me. So I actually want you to kick it off and just tell me what your impressions were as we got to talk to maybe 12 to 15 kids at Meredith, Duke, and NC State. And so why don't you just give your impressions and then I'll share a few pointers.
Sure. I mean, I am not the typical person to go talk to strangers. And I know that sounds silly because all I do all day long is talk to strangers, but they made an appointment to see me. So
Sure.
I feel like they're pretty okay with talking to me. Where random strangers, I have no idea.
I see the difference.
So I think, but because you were there and you're so outgoing and charming, once we started talking to people, I loved it. It was fascinating. I got lots of different perspectives on a lot of different schools, social issues, what's on people's minds. And so I think that if you can push yourself over your shyness, because maybe not everyone gets to go on college tours with Mark Stucker. But if you can push yourself over that, then I think you're going to really learn a lot about the school. And I think we did learn some things about schools that we would not have known from just being there, doing the tour, or, reading about reviews online.
And I want Lisa to kick it off because I remember before we talked to our first student, you said something to the effect of this is not verbatim, but it was something like, this is not my jam. I don't know if I can do this. And by the end, Lisa was just talking as much as I was. You would never know. She was not comfortable with it. And listen, I do acknowledge that there's a person that maybe is not at the point where they can do it, but there are a lot of other people that can do it if they try and they find that people don't bite and they're pretty welcoming. And so I encourage people to step outside their comfort zones. And so today I just want to share sort of what I have learned sort of worked for me. And I encourage you to, modify it, try your own version of it. But this is basically what I have done, and I've done it for a long time. And it doesn't even really bother me if a school's closed down for tours because I can go talk randomly to students and get the behind the scenes, get the real skinny on the place. So first thing I like to do, let's assume I am on a tour, which we were on tours for all of these. I'm like scoping out the area. Like I'm looking for like the busy, highly trafficked places because most of the time, it does depend a lot on how your day is and what your schedule looks like. But normally I'm doing this after my tour. And if there is an info session, after the info session, I know more and more schools are not doing info sessions. They're doing them online, at least during the pandemic. So you may not have an info session. Like we had one at Meredith. We didn't have one at NC State. We only had a tour only there. So most of the time I'm doing it afterward and I'm like scoping out. I'm looking for heavily trafficked sites. And sometimes they're indoors and sometimes they're outdoors. Now, all of ours were really outdoors on this one. And we are in a pandemic. But in the past, I found student centers can be fantastic places as well. But you're basically looking for a place where there's a lot of traffic. And then once you find that place, you just go up. Now, I'm typically saying I'm a college counselor and I'm trying to get to know, you name your school, let's say Duke, because we talked to a lot of people there, getting to know Duke a little more. Would it be okay if I asked you a few short questions? But you would say I'm a student seriously considering attending this school. Would it be okay if I asked you a few short questions? Now, my experience from doing this for a really long time is more than 90% of people say yes. And wouldn't you say in all three campuses, Lisa, like we might have been turned down maybe 3 times, would you say? 4 max?
Yeah, and those people clearly were just like running late. I mean, they would have stopped, but they just didn't have the time.
Correct. And that's mostly the people that turn you down. They're like running late for a class. And one time I just was not observant. Somebody was like sitting there on their computer. I think Lisa picked up the cues, but they were like in a Zoom call,
Right.
So like I just didn't read the cues right on that one. So that's normally what I do. And then I try to be really respectful of their time. So I try to, whatever I ask, I try to kind of honor that. But the success rate normally is over 90%, like usually 90 to 95% of the time people will say yes. You just come at them friendly, you ask them for a few short questions, you can expect, 90 to 95% of the time they say yes. And almost every time when they say no, it's like, sorry, I'm running late. They're pretty respectful. So then I have developed a list of what I found are some of my favorite questions, which I'll share with you. But I encourage you to come up with your own. So I like to start out very positive because I find it kind of creates a really good tone for the conversation. So I like to start by asking, in your opinion, what do you regard as the best strengths of this school? And I find it kind of as a warm question. It's they open up, and this I've changed this over the years. I used to say the best strength, but I said, why am I only asking for one? Like I might get 3 or 4. I like to hear what people say. So now I've changed it from strength singular to strength. So that's one change I've made, actually, just really in the last probably 5 or 6 years. And that's a good question. Now, the second question, I'm going in the opposite direction. I say, if you were in charge and you could change anything about this school to make it better, what would you change? Now, a lot of times they say, Lisa, ooh, that's a good question. How many times do we hear that? But you're really getting beyond the marketing, which is always my goal, is to get beyond the marketing. And so my third question, and this is one that I mix up because I have a lot of questions I like and I kind of mix up. So one of my favorite questions to ask is, what did you not know as an applicant, but you didn't find it out until you got here? That's a really good question. I found it really yields good answers. Another question I sometimes ask is, what do you think are the strongest departments, the strongest programs? That's a question that yields some good answers. And then sometimes I'll ask, what type of student really does well here, and what's the type of student that doesn't do that well here? So I kind of mix those questions up. Those are kind of my questions. I encourage you to come up with your own. But those are ones you always want to ask open-ended questions, right? You don't want to ask how many people go here or whatever. How many people love a campus? Like, not those kinds of things. There are a few questions I regard as totally off limits when you're talking to students, such as, number 1, what was your SAT score? 2, did you apply test optional? 3, where else were you admitted? 4, are you on financial aid? Avoid the intrusive questions. Keep it focused on their opinion of the college and not the personally invasive questions. You want to get them talking. So it's those open-ended questions that you might get a PC version going through the admission process. It is important that you talk to quite a few. A case in point, like I remember when one of the students that Lisa and I talked to at Meredith said one of the things she would change would be the science program or science courses. But then next, 2 or 3 people said science was a strength.
Right.
And so that's why it's really important that you have like a decent sample size. And so it's my goal to talk to 20 when I set foot on a campus. And I've learned that I kind of need a budget about an hour and 15 minutes or an hour 20 to talk to 20. And so sometimes, depending on how your day is, that may not always work. I kind of have a rule of not leaving without talking to 10, which is closer to 40 minutes. And then I think in the 3 schools we visited, we're more in like the 12 to 15 range. So that was a little bit closer to an hour. Now, occasionally you'll get a chatterbox. Remember the student at Duke?
Mm-hmm. We had a couple chatterboxes at Duke, but I love both of them. They were fascinating.
Oh, I love my chatterboxes. They're best because they just act like, they actually almost act like, oh, this is so fun talking to you. Thank you for for the privilege of talking to me. And they open up. And so, you just sort of have to read the cues a little bit. Like I know the one at Duke, I asked all of those questions to her.
Mm-hmm.
And she just opened up. And then she gave us her email in case we have additional questions. Don't expect that, but you kind of do get that about once out of every 20 or 30 times. You have a real friendly, and that's great because you might think of something later. And she was great too because she was a senior. Now, I'll tell you one thing I really learned, and I actually didn't even think about this till Lisa and I were on tour, is because of the pandemic, it's almost like you're really trying to target juniors and seniors. Now, that
Right.
chatterbox at Duke was great because she was a senior. She'd already got her job lined up. She knew what she was doing. The problem with sophomores is they're the new freshmen. They're literally,
Right.
how
Right.
many people told us, Lisa, like, I've only been here, like, you know what I mean, 3 weeks or a month, and because they were sophomores that were online.
No, I mean, Lily is like, at Elon, even though she was there last year, they were pretty much locked down. And so she's like, I don't, she's like, Mom, you know more about this school than I do, because they're just still learning the lay of the land of how it works there.
Yeah, and there's one other thing, and I'm just gonna throw out there's two sides to this, and you can decide for yourself which view you come down on this. So technically, there are only 12 states in the country that you are not allowed to record somebody without their permission. And so some people feel really uncomfortable recording because they're like, I wouldn't want it. I wouldn't want somebody recording me unless they asked me if they could record. And then other people feel like, well, if I'm not going to share it with anybody and I'm not asking for last name and I'm only going to use it just for myself, then I can just talk and not take notes and not even think about it and go back and play it. And I won't share it with anybody. I don't even know their last name. And it avoids me having to remember everything or take notes and I don't know where you come down on that, Lisa.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't know that it was legal to record people without their permission anywhere, actually, because like, I think in Illinois, like that's just a big no-no,
Yeah.
And it somehow comes up a lot too, that it's a no-no in like the course of everyday conversations. I just didn't know there were places that it was fine. I'm sure probably in North Carolina, you can record whoever you want. I have to go look that up.
You can record whoever you want in North Carolina. You can record whoever you want in Georgia. And I'm going to tell you something that you don't even know, but I had my recorder on. I did, and I just did because like then I can go back and actually I have gone back and played some and I just like,
Well, so wait, you recorded me without my permission?
I did. Are you going to dump me for the podcast now?
No.
But I know that's controversial because I do try to live my life by the rule of do unto others you haven't done to you. And I sort of probably would appreciate a courtesy if somebody did that to me. But on the other hand, like, I don't get their last name, and I promise not to share. Well, this is my internal promise. I'm not sharing it with anybody. So I kind of look at it like, what's the harm? All I'm using it to do is to remind myself of exactly what they said later. So, I'll let you come up with your own moral view on that. But I know what the 12 states are that it's illegal in, and I avoid it in those 12 states. North Carolina is not on that list, and neither is Georgia.
All right. Well, there you go. Learn something new every day.
There you go. You learned something new. I didn't even tell Lisa until now. She's learning live on air that I recorded all those conversations. Just the little. You know what? I used to have this nice little like cute little thing. It looked like a keychain and it was a recorder. Now I just use like voice memo on the iPhone. Yeah, I just push the little voice memo on the iPhone kind of thing. So I just do it because it's the same reason why you take pictures and notes when you visit a campus, so they don't all get mixed up in your mind. You don't know who said what or whatever. Like when I go back and listen without distraction, I'm like, I kind of hear all kinds of different things I didn't even hear. So that, anyway, enough on that. Any final thoughts on doing this, Lisa?
I just want to say that, I think when I go to App State, I'm going to push myself to talk to students, even without Mark.
There you go.
Because I just really enjoy talking to the students. We met so many like really amazing people, actually.
Yeah.
Interesting people. So I just think, and most people are really happy to just have someone be interested in what they think. So just remember, like they're doing you a favor, but you're also, doing them a favor by letting them talk about things that are important to them.
I think the point that you said is really important. Like most people, it's kind of a compliment that you value their perspective enough that you want to listen to them and learn from them. So they're kind of a little honored by it.
Mm-hmm.
You do have to read your surroundings because there's a person and you can kind of tell that they say yes and they mean it, but they really do want this thing to be done in 2 to 3 minutes. And you just kind of have to read the tea leaves, like how busy do they look? And there's others. I know like when we were at Duke, we were more in a sitting area. People are like chilling. So anyway, you made me so happy by saying at App State you're going to do it. So I can't wait for the feedback.
I'm going to have to drink before no, just kidding.
Yeah. She's going to get a drink before.
I don't drink, but I'm going to have a flask of vodka, do
coffee.
it down. Yeah, just go in and start. Now, I think it'll be fine.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, excited to have Kevin Newton as our interview for the day. Kevin gives his backstory, and it is an interesting one. He tells us about his company and Education Abroad and what they do to help find undergraduate and graduate universities in other countries other than the United States. And he explains the reasons why students choose to go abroad. Then Kevin talks about how you apply to Oxford or Cambridge University. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm here with Kevin Newton from Dallas, Texas. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Kevin.
It's great to be here, Mark. I've really been looking forward to this for quite some time.
So our regular listeners will remember me mentioning Kevin. Kevin's a specialist in international schools and international admissions. And we work together because if I have someone that wants to go to an international school, I'm like, Kevin, this is your bailiwick. This is your area, your domain. You take over, and he's just fantastic. And so I wanted to introduce him to everybody because it's a growing trend for people to look overseas. And it's a specific knowledge set that you need to be able to do that. And Kevin's our guy. So Kevin, why don't you start by giving us your backstory, where you grew up, where you went to school, what you're doing now, and quite honestly, anything else you want to share.
Sure. And once again, Mark, thanks for having me. I've really been looking forward to this for a while.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
I grew up in the Deep South. I'm originally from East Tennessee, but I went to high school in Florida, and I ended up going to college at William & Mary, which is a great school, and I really enjoyed my time there. I made the most of it. I studied history and Middle Eastern studies. I was a fraternity social chair. I had a great time, but I fell in love with comparative law, specifically Chinese and Islamic law. And I know that's a strange thing for someone from East Tennessee to want to study, but there are weirder things that have happened. And I kept looking around trying to find a place to study what I wanted to study. And there were places that would have a course here or a course there on it, but nowhere in the US was going to let me just study Islamic law and Chinese law. And then I stumbled on the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And they had degrees, entire master's degrees focused on just those fields. Now, I found this out at about 10 p.m. on a Thursday night, and I lived in a fraternity house. Apparently, running through the house screaming that this was so awesome was not what the other brothers really appreciated, but they loved me and they let me away with it. They knew that I was a nerd, so it was okay. So I applied and did the same thing of running through the fraternity house screaming at 6 a.m. a few weeks later when I got in, which was a little less well received.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Grace the first time, not the second.
They'll always forgive you the first time. And then I got over there. And as much as I loved my undergraduate experience, I loved my graduate experience more. It was an opportunity to delve in deep into a subject, very narrow subject, and come out, dare I say, with some expert knowledge on the other end. It was condensed. It was 1 year instead of 2. And what was most shocking of all was I was actually saving money compared to graduate programs here in the U.S. All in all, now this was some time ago, my graduate tuition was covered by a U.S. direct loan or a Stafford loan. That's not necessarily the case anymore because that was 15 or so years ago. But anyway, I graduated on September 15th, 2008. And Mark, I think some of your readers listeners may remember that as the day that Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy.
Oh, it sure was.
And I had this cushy political risk job lined up afterwards. And I called my hopeful boss to find out what was going to happen. And not only was my job no longer there, he was looking for a job.
Ouch.
So I managed to find an opportunity to, and Mark, we've discussed this before, how it was the perfect job for me, given my kind of nerdy inclinations, to help edit an encyclopedia on the Islamic world for a year or so. So I got to...
I can assure you, you're the first one we've had on the podcast that's been an encyclopedia editor.
You know, it was awesome, but it wasn't a forever job. That wasn't going to last forever, and that's okay. So I came back to the U.S. and, like most William and Mary students, ended up in Washington, D.C., with all of my friends asking me, well, you went abroad. How did you do it? And soon I had friends of friends asking, and people I'd never heard of asking, well, you've done this. How do you do it? And about 7 years ago, I decided, I've been giving out this advice. Let's make it something a bit more formal. And that's where we are today.
Yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about your company? Because while it's true that Kevin and I partner together, he has his own company as well. Talk to us a little bit about, your company and anything else you want to share.
Sure. So my company's name's An Education Abroad. And like I said, we've been in business 6 or 7 years, and we've been helping students, both undergraduates and grad students, go overseas for their educations. We typically don't help with just a semester abroad. We feel that that's best done through your home university. But we help make sure that the degree you're getting overseas is going to not only be something that's professionally fulfilling, but also personally fulfilling. We've helped students apply to a number of universities around the world, ranging from the National the National Australian University in Australia to Oxford and Cambridge to schools in France. We've even had a few go to the Middle East. So I've got to use some of the long latent Arabic knowledge. But
there you go.
In general, what we find is that students want to go abroad for a few different reasons, whether it's cost, whether it's a sense of adventure, whether it's they don't want certain factors mattering on their admissions profile. Whatever their reason, we're happy to help.
So let's delve into some of those reasons. So let's talk about costs. Can you give us a sense of what kind of costs you're looking at? And I know it can vary different parts of the world, different systems, but just kind of give us an overview of what you're looking at cost-wise for a real quality school.
Right. So you've got some huge variations here. We'll start with the worst end, which are the Oxfords and Cambridges of the world. Oxford and Cambridge for international students can be very expensive. And something I like to look at is the cost of the entire degree versus just the cost of a year. And that's not even, frankly, because American students take sometimes more than 4 years to graduate. It's just because I think it's a better all-around number to look at. For Oxford, the cost of a degree, depending on your field, is anywhere between $180,000 and $220,000 for a 3-year undergraduate degree. I should add that most European countries, including England, not Scotland, but England, do have 3-year bachelor's degrees. There are options for 4. We can get into that later, but you can typically get a bachelor's degree in 3 years. So at Oxford, it's going to cost around $180,000 to $220,000, depending on your field. To put that into some level of perspective, and I've said all sorts of nice things about William and Mary now so that I can use them and not feel bad about it. An in-state Virginian student is going to pay a similar amount at that lower end, the 180 end, to study history like I did. If he or she wants to study business, you're approaching that $200,000 level. And of course, there's more financial aid options for Virginian students. And we can talk about financial aid overseas and how that works in a few minutes. But the point is, if you're a parent who's looking to pay full cost for your child's tuition, that's the expensive end. A full education at a place like the London School of Economics comes in at around, again, depending on your field of study, anywhere from $140,000 to $150,000. And I want to take a moment and say that I'm not just including tuition here, and I'm including total cost of attendance, as well as for the European universities, the cost of 2 round-trip plane tickets, so you can come home during the winter and come home during the summer, as well as around $1,500 or so to travel around Europe, because frankly, what's the point of being over there if you can't travel? So I want to emphasize that this isn't going over there and living a very basic lifestyle. Again, you're going to be a student, or your child's going to be a student, but they're not going to be, if they play everything right and budget accordingly, which, Mark, I think you've probably had that conversation a few times with some people who you've worked with, the importance of not blowing through everything at first. That's more than enough. Now, a lot of people think that college is free overseas, but they forget about room and board. So the base that I could ever come up with, the lowest number I could ever come up with, is still around $15,000 or $16,000 per year. So let me be clear, this is not a cost-saving mechanism if your family's looking at Pell Grants or something like that, which is unfortunate, but I just want to be upfront with everybody about that from the very beginning.
A lot of people would be really ecstatic at 15, 20, 25, 30, and in many cases 40 as well, especially for, I mean, you're talking about some world-renowned universities as well.
Right. We're getting into, once you're spending past that point, you've already eclipsed the cost of your local in-state flagship university. And again, for William and Mary, UVA comes pretty close. For UC Berkeley and UCLA, that's a conversation you can have even at an Oxford level. But for a number of states, if you're looking at anything beyond that point, in real cost terms of what's paid, not necessarily sticker price, but what your family's going to end up having to write a check for, going overseas can save considerably.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, I have mentioned iPEDS data before on the podcast multiple times, and I've recommended College Navigator website before that uses iPEDS data as a recommended resource. But thanks to a recommendation from one of our great listeners, shout out to Rob in Texas, I now have a new favorite website for accessing accurate iPEDS data on every college and university. Absolutely can't wait to tell you about this. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit more about iPEDS. iPEDS is an acronym that stands for the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. And iPEDS consists of these 12 different interrelated surveys that are collected in the fall, the winter, and the spring each year by the National Center of Educational Statistics, also just known as NCES. And that's actually part of the division of the Department of Education. And so the completion of all of these iPED surveys is mandatory for all colleges if they want to participate in any federal financial assistance program authorized by Title IX of the Higher Education Act of 1965. So this data is legit. The iPEDS program and the Department of NCS was created in 1992, and it began collecting this data in 93. Any college that receives federal funding must comply and submit this iPEDS data. It is the most accurate, comprehensive way to get college data. So a recommended resource for episode 196 is the best website to get iPEDS data with colorful graphs and charts and data galore. It is the website datausa.io. Now, when you go to datausa.io, just click the Universities tab and search for data on thousands of colleges and universities. I'll just give you one example of the great data you'll be able to find in this website. If you go to datausa.io, click Universities, search for University of Iowa, our college spotlight of this week. And the website will let you know hundreds of things. But one thing I want to point out is which degrees have been the most common in 2019, but also 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, and 2012. Let's get more granular. You will see in 2012, 13, and 14, if you look at the University of Iowa, that kinesiology and exercise science was not one of the top 3 degrees. But ever since 2015, something shifted because it's been the most frequent degree issued. At least 8% of all degrees at the University of Iowa have been in kinesiology and exercise science from 2015 till now. This is just one tidbit of the hundreds of data points at your fingertips. You've heard me rave about the common data set before. This is like the common data set with graphs and charts and color, very visually aesthetic. And for those of you who make this podcast possible by financially supporting our podcast, your bonus content from us in October is going to be a much deeper dive in how to use this incredible website. So look for this in your email in late October. We will now return to my interview with Kevin Newton. Let's talk about some other reasons besides cost that people come to you and they say, I want an international experience. I think I'd like to go to school for 4 years in another country. What else comes to mind besides cost as reasons why you frequently hear?
I think they can be broken down into 2 different fields. What can I get out of it, and what do I have to put into it? And we'll start with the what do I have to put into it. And the cost goes into a little bit of that because you're still coming out with a university degree after so many years for a lower cost. But it's also how admissions are handled. And here in the United States, we, especially at elite universities, we use holistic admissions, which I can't say anything bad about because I wouldn't have gotten into my university without holistic admissions. But overseas, it's a much more grade driven and test performance driven. So for those listeners out there who are wondering, well, my child does great on the ACT, SAT, or AP exams and all this test optional stuff, this is the other side to that coin, because the UK is never going to go test optional. It's just not going to happen. It's too built into the way they do things.
Kevin, we should probably say that's really how you and I met.
Absolutely.
Kevin and I are both part of a Facebook group for college counselors and admissions professionals. It's like invitation only kind of group, but it's a large group. And we just were communicating back and forth there quite a bit. And then we said, let's take this conversation offline here. And for a while, Kevin and I were talking about twice a week, just learning more about him and what he does, and his passion for what he does and his commitment to customer service really impressed me. And next thing I was reaching out, said, I'd like to talk to some people you've worked with. And, you got the highest praise there. But yeah, that's how it all started with us having this conversation, along this topic of what about a kid that really blows the test scores out of the water, but maybe their extracurriculars aren't that robust. And at one time I had sort of vented to him that, boy, I'll work with these kids that get 1550s on their SATs and 3536s on their ACTs, and they'll think they can be competitive at certain schools that put a huge emphasis on holistic admissions that are some of the most selective institutions in the country. And that kind of student is just an average applicant from a testing profile in there, and they're looking for so much more when it comes to extracurriculars, recommendations and all the other pieces, institutional priorities. And Kevin said, well, those kind of kids, I got schools that love kids like that. And so that's how it all started with us. Yeah.
And please let me be clear. I'm not trying to take away from the kids who can do it all and who can balance everything. They're phenomenal. All kids are different. And, that's a reason that all colleges are different. That's a reason that, I've been lucky enough to see some of the lists that Mark puts out, and the amount of thought that goes into them is just mind blowing. And that's from someone who knows marginally more about the American college experience or admissions experience than the typical person. Just because there are people out there like Mark. But anyway, so it's the admissions process they feel is quite different and may or may not be to their advantage.
Hey, Kevin, let's go into that because I think that's probably interesting to people. And by the way, let me say this. I don't want to imply that if you're not crushing your ACT or SAT, you can't go overseas.
Oh,
because there are a lot of schools over there that Kevin can place kids at that do okay in the testing, but they don't blow it out of the water. So I don't want to at all give that impression. Kevin was just telling me that kid can compete at the most selective schools, oftentimes in other countries. So I wanted to clarify that. But why don't you shed some light on how an applicant is evaluated in a non-holistic sense? So what are the things that are going to matter?
So, Mark, if it's okay with you, what I'll do is I'll look at a student who's maybe at one of those more selective universities. Like
sure, whatever you want.
We'll do Oxford or Cambridge, for example. And then we'll look at a less selective but still quite top-notch university.
Good. I like the idea of sharing both. Go ahead.
So at an Oxford or a Cambridge, on any kind of UK application, it's called UCAS. It's essentially the common app, but limited to 5 programs, and it's only $30 to apply to those 5 programs. You can only apply to either Oxford or Cambridge. So you apply, and you've already put in thought what you want to study. So let's, for example, at Cambridge right now, again, this is appealing to the nerd in me, but the coolest sounding degree they've got is Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Norse Studies, which if you can convince yourself that you want to study Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Norse Studies, you've got about a 60% chance of getting into Cambridge.
Wow.
But you've got to prove that you've got the passion for it. And just watching the Vikings on the History Channel is not going to cut it. So you identify what you want to study. You have one person write you a generalized letter of recommendation that focuses on your academics. You write one personal statement of about 4,000 characters that talks about your passion for this field without necessarily betraying what universities you're applying to, because all the universities you apply to see the same letter of recommendation and the same personal statement. You apply it at Oxford and Cambridge, there's almost inevitably an assessment test. So, for example, for a history degree, and I'm pretty sure I've not looked in the last few months, but because this may shock you, not a lot of people, despite that, want to apply for Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Viking studies at Cambridge. I can't figure out why. But typically for history, for example, it's the history admissions test. And what this test does is it gives you some background information and some primary source documents, and you're expected to draw conclusions from that. It's nothing that you will have studied before. It's nothing that any other candidate will have studied before. They're trying to establish a score based off your abilities to use the tools of a historian. If you do well on that, you're invited to an interview. And this isn't going to be a typical American university style interview. To borrow from physics, for example, one of my favorite questions that comes up on this, and you're all allowed to think of me a little bit differently after hearing this, is in times before the pandemic, they would offer you a glass of water and then ask you, before that water, the ice in that water melts, can you tell me when it does melt, is the water level going to increase, decrease, or stay the same? And what they're looking for is a discussion with you to see how your mind works around that problem.
This is sounding very University of Chicago right now.
I was going to say, I have a student right now who's applying to one of those universities, and I asked him, well, where are you applying in the U.S.? And he said the University of Chicago. I said, okay, you're good. But it is that they want to attract smart people. They want to find the most brilliant people they can within that field, and they feel that they've got the way of doing it. So because it is structured on what your major is going to be, for lack of a better term, what the title of your degree is going to be, that leads a lot of variability to acceptance rates. Like I said, if you want to study Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Norse or Viking studies, you've got a very high acceptance rate. Again, you have to prove that you can do it. If you want to study, say, computer science, it's much lower. It's about 6% right now at Cambridge. Now, there's one big missing piece to all this, and those are your AP scores. Cambridge requires 5 AP scores of 5. Oxford requires 3 full-length, year-long AP scores of 5. So stacking AP Psych and AP Government and AP Economics isn't going to do it for Oxford. They want to see that you've put in the work in an AP US History, an AP English Literature, AP Chemistry, something like that. And they all have to be somewhat relevant to what you want to study. In some cases, they tell you what they want to see, but in a lot of cases, they don't. So for our student applying for Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Norse studies, they would need to have a history score. They would need to have an English literature or language score, and they would probably also want to have a foreign language score, because you're either going to be studying Old English or Celtic or Norse as a part of that degree.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Okay, friends, we are on number 93 on our spotlights, getting close to the big 100. And it is the University of Iowa, the flagship university for the state of Iowa. And this is, there's some similarities with NC State here. It's a very proud institution with a lot of tradition. And I feel like there's a few things you kind of need to know to understand Iowa. One is Iowa City. Like, Iowa is right in Iowa City, and Iowa City is the 5th largest city in Iowa. It's got 75,000 people, more liberal than most of the parts of Iowa. And it just gets rave reviews as a college town. It's one of these towns that it's right by the college. And so the students have access to small bookstores, restaurants, coffee shops, live music, dancing, food festivals, art shows. Like, all of that is like just pop outside and walk, and it's all kind of right there. And I think, it's important to understand that to sort of get a sense of the university. Now, there are 3 main spots where everyone hangs out. One is the library. One is the Iowa Memorial Student Union. They just refer to it as the IMU. And then downtown, especially just these few streets right around the school. The other thing I think that's important to understand Iowa is football fever. I mean, Kinnick Stadium rocks. This the Hawkeyes are their nicknames. They're in the Big Ten. It is infectious. And they travel. I mean, if Iowa's like playing at, in a Rose Bowl or something. I mean, they come in droves. And I know for people that maybe not be into football, Lisa, they may not they may not get this, but it's almost like, if you go to a family reunion, right? It's sort of like there's, that you're like kin, there's like your blood relatives. And it's almost like the black and gold runs through the blood, and it like unites the alumni in a way where you could be anywhere in the country and go to an Iowa sports bar, and there's going to be an immediate connection with your fellow Hawkeye, and they'll probably hook you up for a job if they can. And so it just like bonds and unites the alumni, and it's a major, major source of fun for the students. The campus is interesting, Greek Revival architecture, over 300 buildings. And then the other thing that I think really kind of gives them this pride is that they're the first school that did a lot of different things. And so these are all some of their first. So they're the first to open a co-ed med school. In 1855, they were the first public university, to admit both men and women on an equal basis. They were also the world's first to accept creative work in theater, writing, music, and art on an equal basis as academic research. They were the first state university to recognize gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and that was in 1970. And they were the first law school west of the Mississippi River. They were the first university to use television in education. They did that back in 1932. They were one of the very first institutions to grant a law degree to women. That was 1873. A law degree to African Americans, 1879. So I mentioned that they're the first university to accept creative projects as theses for advanced degrees. Traditional graduate study culminates in writing a scholarly thesis, but Iowa created this whole creative works where you can do poems, you can do paintings, you can do musical composition, and you can present it to a graduate college in support of your degree. And so they really established the first sort of unique and creative Masters of Fine Arts degree. And you can't say something about Iowa without talking about their writing program. It's like clearly their most famous program. I know you're familiar with it. I just want to take a pause for a second, see if you want to say anything so far, Lisa.
Oh, well, I mean, of course, Iowa is a very popular school among the students in Illinois. I mean, it's not that far away. There are a lot of alumni parents who wouldn't have their kids go anywhere else. And it's a really popular school, and I think there's a lot of strong programs that they have. And I don't know if they're still doing this, but they had this like interesting admissions rubric where like you could kind of tell if you're getting admitted by a mathematical combination of your GPA and your test score. Although I'm not sure if they're doing that now because they're test optional.
I'll comment on that in a second, but several things you said resonated. So they are 58% of the students are from Iowa, but by overwhelmingly, Illinois is the second biggest state. You know what I meant to research, but I never did? I don't know if you know this, Lisa. Is there any reciprocity agreement with Illinois?
I think there's like a Midwest compact. So I think they have that with Missouri too. And like, I think it's like a little bit off.
So let's talk about the writing program because it's what they're known for. A lot of people regard them as the top writing program in the country, especially creative writing. Like that, they would be considered the top writing program in the country. It's not just like their opinion. Obviously, there's always debate on these things and they're subjective. And, you may not want to go to school in Iowa. So I'm not trying to say that they're for everybody, but their program's phenomenal. They established the Iowa's Writers Workshop. They founded it in 1936. And it was the idea of bringing together these high-level poets and fiction writers. And they established the first creative writing program in the country. And it's literally become like the model, the prototype for over 300 different writing programs all over the country. And most of the people that lead those 300 programs, they are graduates that came through Iowa's Writing Workshop program. So their alumni just spanned all over the country. And even when you look at like they have 46 people that have won the Pulitzer Prize, and 17 of them came through this program, through the Iowa Writers Workshop. And so it's just a really world-renowned program that they have. Now, They also have some other really strong programs. Journalism, of course, is very strong, but they're also very strong in anything related to like pre-med, pre-health, nursing, pharmacy, med tech, physician assistant. The major they have offered the most degrees in every year since 2015 is kinesiology and exercise science. All that stuff is very strong. They have what's regarded as one of the absolute top teaching hospitals, like right there. And so that draws a lot of high level talent in the medical field. They pride themselves on a place where art meets science. And they also do have strong engineering as well. Another thing that they're really known for is the research. So 1 in 3 students actually work on research. One of the very popular places is the pharmacy lab that they have. But they have a program that's just, they refer to it as ICRU. It's like Iowa Creative Research Fellows Program. And what they do is they fund 1,400 students. It's over $3 million to do undergraduate research and creative projects. And the nice thing is this is not just in like the health fields, it's literally in any discipline. And so this is paid research that happens both throughout the school year as well as over the summer. So basically what happens is that each year the students and their mentors, they apply for this ICRU research fellowship, and they get either $2,000 during the school year to do research, and they only have to work 5 to 6 hours a week. So it's actually pretty good pay when you look at the hourly. And then, or they can do a summer, which is $2,500 for 10 weeks. And even that, it's not full time. It's like 15 to 20 hours a week during the summer, and they can get $2,500. So like that's a really big program they have that's really popular. They also have some combined degrees, which are pretty cool. You could get a liberal arts degree, a business degree. You can combine liberal arts with engineering. You can combine liberal arts with nursing. Lisa, what's your experience with the Illinois residents? Like, were they going there for certain programs, or was it a mixture?
Yeah, well, I mean, nursing is a huge one that people consider. Anything health sciences related. Of course, the writing program. But, I think like a lot of times kids will go for business,
Sure.
Pre-law. I mean, there's just like a kind of very solid school with a lot of great offerings.
Hmm.
So it draws from a lot of different interests bases, I think.
Yeah, and they do have a reputable law school, so the pre-law doesn't surprise me. But once again, if you listen to what you said a lot of health sciences, of course, the writing and business as well. So let's talk a little bit about their admission process, which you referred to a second ago. So they are the classic admissions by the numbers school. Most people call that formulaic admissions or guaranteed admissions. You'll hear all kinds of different terms. Admission by the numbers is my term, but they're crunching numbers is what they're doing. And they're using a rubric, and their formula is just crystal clear. It's transparent. It's right on their website. And normally it's just an intersection of GPA and test scores, and they have a numerical equivalent. And basically you need a 245 on their scale in-state and a 255 out-of-state. Now, of course, things are changing a little bit in the age of COVID. They're rolling admissions, so they literally will make a decision right at the end of your junior year. You can have an answer really quickly. That hasn't changed. You just go to uiowa.edu, you create an account. You're self-reporting your cumulative GPA. They want you. They're very clear. They walk you right through it. List your core courses. They are looking at majors, so you do need to pick 2 majors, a first major or second major, but you can also pick open, which is like, we've all used all these terms before, like undecided, undeclared, all kinds of different names out there, right? I forget the term last week. Lisa, you remember? It was 20% of the students at NC State. It was a term they used. It was basically a fancy word for saying undecided. That sounded better. I can't remember it. But Iowa uses the term open. And they're going to look at you through that prism. Now, they are test optional for this year. But this is a school that's actually test optional, that it's pretty clear they're doing that biting, scratching, clawing, fighting. You can tell they really don't want to be test optional. One, that was the 2 pillars in the rubric, right? Testing and GPA. And they actually do come out and say, we're test optional, but we strongly encourage you to submit your test scores. So they're kind of tipping their hand that they really do like test scores. Their process is pretty simple. They'll take applications right up until May 1st. March 1st is kind of the cutoff date, though, to get some money. And December 1st is really a priority date for scholarships. They do have both need-based and merit-based money, and your application automatically qualifies you for scholarship money. So I would strongly encourage anybody applying to shoot for the December 1st day.
Mm.
Politically, Iowa's become a pretty solid red state in the last 12 years. I mean, it went blue in 2008 with Obama, but ever since it's drifted quite red. But this is a pretty left-leaning campus, so it's a little bit of a blue oasis in a pretty red state. And it's also really prides itself on its support for the LGBTQ community. As far as a few things that, maybe some people may like or not like, it can get cold in Iowa. So I don't think I ever shared this with you, Lisa, but Karis did like several of these like multicultural fly-in programs. She did one to Davidson, she did one to Scripps, and she did one to Grinnell, which of course is in Iowa. And they picked her up at the airport. And I saw that bill. They sent the bill. That was almost $1,000 for that airline ticket. But she was driving, and you're driving through cornfields to get to Grinnell, right? From the airport. And it was October, early October. And she sent me a text. She's like, Dad, it's 38 degrees here, and it's just the start of October.
Well, yeah, when the wind moves across the prairie, it can get pretty dang cold.
Yeah. So she wasn't even there yet. And she's like, I'm not feeling this. So if you're a weak weather weenie, as Dave calls me, it could be a little tough. It's also not the most racially diverse school because it's Iowa and the state doesn't have a high level of diversity. So if that's something you like a lot, that may not be something that they can provide compared to some schools. And it's not a really big study abroad school either. Only 1 out of 20 students goes abroad.
That's really
That doesn't
low.
mean there's not opportunities. It doesn't mean there are not opportunities, but it's just not really the culture. Does that surprise you a little, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's kind of an outlier for most colleges where you might say like, over half the kids do it. So.
And some of the big overlaps are other Big Ten schools like Illinois, of course, Minnesota, Indiana, and then Iowa State, which is the land-grant school right in the state that has, of course, very strong agricultural programs. I'm going to fire off a few stats. I don't have as many as normal. And see if you want to make any closing comments, Lisa.
Okay.
1,770 acres. So it's a pretty large campus. In-state, it's really a bargain. $26,000 really is your cost of attendance. That's all in-state. So that's actually pretty good. I mean, if you look at that, that's about $20,000 less than an in-state Virginia student that wants to study at their School of Commerce. So you can see the big disparity between some in-state schools. Out of state, it's a little closer to 47, 48. Of course, depends how far you're traveling and what your lifestyle's like. 28% of students live on campus. They mostly live on campus, then move off, usually after their freshman year. One of the things you'll hear consistently from students at Iowa is that it's a big school, but it has a small feel.
Mm-hmm.
And 23,482 are the undergraduates, where 30,318 are the total students. It's 55% female, 45% male. It does take a pretty big range of students, so it's got an 83% acceptance rate. And some of the students complain that, some of the higher achieving students complain, like, I'll be beside a really highly motivated student on one side and a total slacker to the right. So they take a range of students. It's not necessarily the hardest to get in. And I'm glad to see that there's schools out there, for the student that's not the A student, because you don't need to be to get into Iowa. It's got a 22% yield, meaning they're getting about 1 in 5 of every kids that they admit. 74% white, 8% Hispanic, 5% Asian, 3% Black, 4% international, 4% biracial. As far as testing, the middle 50% for both evidence-based reading and writing and math is a 560 to a 650 in each section, and ACT is 22 to 29. And the ACT was literally birthed in Iowa. It's the birthplace of the ACT. So the ACT literally dominates test scores there. Like 87% of people that submitted scores submitted an ACT.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really it. Lisa, any final comments before we wrap Iowa up?
Well, I think Iowa's a really interesting state. And I didn't really know what to expect until I, visited Iowa briefly, but there are parts of it that are really beautiful. It's very politically diverse. It's sort of a lot of really interesting different types of communities, the types of ways of making a living. So, I mean, I think there's, it's really got a cross section of America going there. Iowa's a really solid school for a lot of things. And it's a great option. It's, for people who want to either get a lot of merit aid, who want to go into the health sciences, or just, maybe high school wasn't totally their thing, but they're kind of coming into their own and they want to really get into a different subject. It's a great spot for them.
Yeah, I find that it's got strong regional Midwest appeal.
Mm-hmm.
I never hardly have anybody ask me about Iowa on the West Coast or the East Coast unless they want writing,
Mm-hmm.
which in some ways is a shame because they do have some other really, really strong programs. But maybe people like me need to stop talking about the weather and how like it's so much farmland out there, because I think that stereotype can hurt it when it's not in the middle of nowhere. It's not in the middle of nowhere. This is not a school that's in the middle of nowhere.
Right. I mean, Iowa City is actually like a great town, and there's nothing wrong with farmland, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
beautiful in its own way, and it provides needed food. So where would we be without it?
I'm really glad you brought that up. There's absolutely nothing wrong with farmland. I find most of the students that I work with, if they think a place is remote, it's a really tough sell. And that's why I want to really stress this is not remote.
Mm-mm.
And the thing about Iowa City is it's kind of built around the whole university. And so it has it's been actually, I mean, you know how I feel about rankings and all that, but it's been several people have put it up there as one of the top college towns in the country. It's like consistently been one of those schools that gets up there, like the Ann Arbors and East Lansings and the Bloomingtons and the Athens and so many of those schools. And I personally do love like places that feel like a college town, that feels like the whole town is sort of revolves around the college. I feel it just gives it an energy, and Iowa has that.
Yeah.
Did you ever look there at all? Because they have decent communications. We didn't talk about communications, but it's pretty good.
We talked about it, but as you know, Lily refused to consider any college that was in a state that started with I, except for she made an exception for Indiana University because, I mean, their communications department was just that good that even she couldn't deny that. But if it started with I, she wasn't into it. And I don't know where she came up with that rule, but because there's plenty of farmland around Elon.
What I think is funny is that she had an Indiana exception.
Yeah, it was a carve out. You know what I'm
she
saying?
did a carve out. Well, thanks, Lisa. I knew that your Midwest roots would help here because it is so popular in Illinois.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, for you people on the coast, the Midwest
You
is
people,
like,
this is Ross Perot. You people,
yeah, y'all on the coast, like, Midwest is like has a lot to offer. There's a lot of very smart people, very cosmopolitan places, fantastic restaurants. It's not just flyover territory. There is actually stuff happening there, and you might want to be part of it.
No, it's true. It's true. And a lot of times, like the value for your money proposition is really strong in Midwest schools.
Mm-hmm.
Like East Coast schools and West Coast schools, especially in metropolitan areas, like there's a premium that gets added to the price on those places. So when you're looking for the value proposition, there's just a really strong value proposition, not just at Iowa, but at a lot of these schools. And so I always tell people, just keep an open mind. Keep an open mind. If you visit and don't like it, take it off, but keep an open mind. Well, I'm trying to have this goal of making it to every flagship.
Yeah,
And so we
fun.
did Cornell College before, which is in Iowa, but this is only our second visit to Iowa. And so we're trying to go around the country and get all the flagships because there's a lot of very positive things that come with a flagship school.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa's going to do one for us on Missouri at some point.
Yes, that's in my docket.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa.
All right, thank you.
Next week in the news, admission surveys in a wild year. Scott Jasek of Inside Higher Ed. Next week, Mark, Lisa, and Sylvia will discuss 3 questions. Number 1, what if students refuse to do the things necessary to complete a college application? Number 2, what is the right balance of parent involvement versus student ownership? And number 3, what to do if your child doesn't do a lot of activities. Our interview will be part 2 of 2 with Kevin Newton, the founder of An Education Abroad, on how to do college overseas. And our college spotlight comes to you from Troy, New York. It is RPI, which stands for Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
All right. See you next week, my friend.
All right.
My brother from another mother. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please subscribe so you get every episode as soon as it is released. If you are interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on your favorite podcast listening app. I am the producer of the Your College Bound Kid podcast. We have a fantastic team of 9 people. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. David Williams and Dr. Lisa Ruff. Our sound engineer who fixes all of our many errors is Nemanja Motvich. The amazing music you hear is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Boss. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Dalianas Dimitri. If you want to have a college coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want to ask, or a college you want Lisa or me to do a spotlight on, or if you have a recommended resource or an article you think we should share, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you, our family, next week.